The bus shelter on Maple Avenue looked like it had been forgotten by time. The paint was chipped. The bench had initials carved into it by bored teenagers, and the faded timetable fluttered in the cold breeze of a gray morning. Only one person sat there. A woman, probably in her late 20s, knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if keeping her from falling apart. Her name was Lee. Her dark auburn hair was tangled, strands sticking to her damp face. She wasn't sobbing loud or dramatically. Her tears were quiet, desperate, like raindrops falling from a sky that had already given up. In her hand, she clutched a picture, a worn-out photo of two people laughing. You could tell it mattered not because of how it looked, but by how gently she held it, like it was the only thing she still trusted. Across the street, a father was walking with his young daughter. Evan Hart, a quiet man in his mid-30s with the kind of tired eyes that came from juggling grief, parenting, and 12-hour shifts at the auto shop. His daughter Rosie, 6 years old, had hair the color of burnt honey and a smile full of unfiltered curiosity. They came this way every Saturday, heading to the local farmer's market, his attempt to keep some routine in their life. Rosie stopped walking. She saw Lee. Evan noticed the shift, his parental radar immediately alert. "Come on, kiddo," he murmured, gently tugging her hand. "Let's give her some space, okay?" But Rosie didn't move. She wasn't staring with discomfort or confusion. She was looking with something bigger, something most adults lose over time: empathy. "Daddy," she whispered, "that lady looks like her heart hurts." Evan felt a jolt in his chest. He glanced at Lee, then back at Rosie. "I know, sweetheart, but sometimes when adults are sad, they don't want anyone to bother them." Rosie looked unconvinced. She gently slipped her hand from her father's and began walking toward the bench. "Rosie," Evan warned gently, "come back, baby." But it was too late. Rosie, small and brave in her yellow coat and mismatched socks, walked right up to the crying woman. Lee quickly wiped her cheeks, startled by the sudden presence of a child. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other. Then Rosie spoke, softly, kindly, confidently. "Hi, I think you might need a hug. Can I give you one?" Lee blinked. No one had asked her what she needed in months, maybe years. Before she could stop herself, she nodded. And when those tiny arms wrapped around her, something cracked open inside her chest, something she thought had turned to stone. She didn't sob louder, she just breathed differently. Evan approached slowly, cautious, yet visibly moved. Even he could sense that this moment was different, not intrusive, not awkward, but strangely right. "I'm sorry," Lee said softly when she finally pulled away, slightly embarrassed. "I didn't mean to fall apart in public." "No apologies needed," Evan said gently. "We've all had days like that." Rosie looked up, eyes big and earnest. "My mom used to say hugs help fix the sad parts of your heart." Lee smiled through fresh tears. "Your mom sounds wise." "She is," Rosie answered, then paused. "In heaven now, but she still knows stuff." Lee looked at Evan, who gave a soft nod as if confirming the unspoken truth. Loss was something he understood, too. The moment hung in the chilly morning air, heavy, tender, real. Evan hesitated, then spoke. "We're heading to the farmer's market. You're welcome to join us. It's warm there, lots of coffee, and less sad." Lee hesitated. She had been invisible for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be invited. But Rosie held out her hand. "Come with us. You can help me pick the best strawberries." And just like that, without any dramatic music or Hollywood moment, Lee stood up and walked with them, not knowing that this single choice would change everything. What if the hug wasn't just the beginning of healing, but the beginning of a family neither of them were expecting? The Maple Avenue Farmers Market was alive with chatter, bright colors, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with cinnamon. Vendors called out happily, Children played between stalls, and folk guitar music floated in the background. It was the kind of place where life felt simple and safe. A world Lee hadn't felt a part of in a long time. She walked slowly beside Evan and Rosie, hands tucked into her sleeves. She wasn't sure if she belonged here or with them. But every few steps, Rosie would look back and smile, as if reminding her, "You're allowed to be here." They arrived at the strawberry stand first, where bright ruby-red berries gleamed under the morning sun. "Okay," Rosie announced importantly, placing her hands on her hips. "Show me how to find the good ones. I always pick mushy ones and Daddy pretends they're still okay." Evan rolled his eyes. "That was one time," Lee chuckled. It was the first time she'd laughed in weeks. She knelt beside Rosie, picking up a berry by the stem with careful fingers. "You don't squeeze them," she explained softly. "You look for ones with a little shine, no bruises, and a sweet smell. And the stem should be green, not brown." Rosie smelled it deeply. "Smells like sunshine," she declared. Evan raised a brow. "Well, sunshine smells expensive." Lee laughed again, this time more freely. They bought a basket, and Rosie held Lee's hand without hesitation, as if she had known her forever. Lee didn't hold back this time. She held on. They wandered toward a coffee stall. Evan bought hot chocolate for Rosie, black coffee for himself, and paused when he got to Lee. "What do you like?" he asked gently. The question froze her. She couldn't remember the last time someone asked what she liked. People mostly asked when she was leaving whether she had ID where she had to go next. Coffee with cream. No sugar," she answered slowly, surprised that she remembered. "Good choice," Evan said, without pity, without awkwardness. Just kindness. They sat on a bench near the little fountain. Rosie munched on strawberries. Evan sipped his coffee. Lee just held hers, letting the warmth seep into her palms. No one rushed the moment. After a while, Rosie turned to Lee. "Are you sad because of the lady in your picture?" Lee stiffened. How could a child's question be both so simple and so piercing? "Yes," she said softly. She was my sister, my best friend, and I lost her. Not long ago." "Did she go to heaven too?" Rosie asked. Lee's throat worked before she finally whispered, "I hope so. She deserved heaven. She was the kindest person I've ever known." Rosie nodded wisely, as if confirming a universal truth. "Sometimes nice people leave early. Daddy says it's because they already finished their job here." Evan didn't interrupt. He heard his daughter's words and his eyes softened. "I don't know what my sister's job was," Lee said, tears threatening again. "All I know is that when she left, I lost direction." Rosie reached out and held her hand again. "Maybe you're still finding it." Something about those words quieted Lee's heart. They walked together through the market, this strange trio that somehow felt less strange with each step. The wind was brisk, but there was warmth too, not from the sun, which was still hidden, but from something else. Possibility. Before they reached the exit, Evan stopped. "We're grabbing lunch at a little diner around the corner," he said. "They have grilled cheese that Rosie claims can fix almost anything." "Almost everything," Rosie corrected, "except broccoli." Lee hesitated. She had no money, no plan, no promise she wouldn't ruin everything by crying again, but somehow she still said yes. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with certainty, it begins with company. But what happens when a simple lunch turns into something far more life-changing? A question that could alter all three of their lives. The diner sat at the corner of Cedar and Fifth, the kind of place where the sign flickered at night and the smell of buttered toast lingered on every surface. The bell above the door rang softly as they walked in, and the warmth inside wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. Rosie ran ahead to claim the booth by the window, the one with the view of the street, where people and stories passed by like moving chapters. Evan slid into the seat across from her. Lee hesitated for a moment before Evan nodded gently toward the empty space beside Rosie. "You're not intruding," he assured her. "You're joining." The words landed softly. They ordered 3 grilled cheese sandwiches, one with extra cheese for Rosie, her universe special, and hot tomato soup that steamed up the booth in comforting clouds. For a while, they simply ate. No forced smiles, no empty chatter. Just quiet company. Sometimes silence can be healing when it's shared. Halfway through her soup, Rosie looked at Lee with a sudden brightness. "Are you hungry every day?" Evan almost choked on his coffee. "Rosie," but Lee didn't flinch. She nodded slowly. "Not always," she said honestly, "but sometimes it's been hard." Rosie was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked, "Do you have a place to sleep?" This time Evan stepped in, softly but firm. "Sweetheart, that's not something Lee surprised him. "I don't," she said softly. "Not really. Some nights at the shelter, some nights anywhere I can." Rosie's little brows furrowed with concern. She turned to her father, eyes wide, earnest. "Daddy, she needs help." Her tone wasn't naive. It was certain. Evan felt it then. That unseen tug in his heart, that moment where something inside him whispered, "This matters." He looked at Lee for a long moment, not with pity, not with rescue, but with recognition. Loss recognizes loss, and broken recognizes broken. "Lee," he said quietly, carefully, "I have something I want to ask, and I hope it doesn't sound strange." She looked up, breath caught. He hesitated, then continued. "I have a small studio above my garage. It's empty, not fancy, needs some cleaning, maybe a new light bulb, but it has heat, a shower, a door that locks. It's safe." Lee's breathing changed, soft, sharp, stunned. Before she could respond, Evan continued more gently. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering a trade. I work long hours. Rosie's after-school care isn't great. I could use help, someone home when she gets back from school, someone patient, someone who reads stories." Rosie perked up. "She reads stories like magic." Lee's eyes glistened, but not with the same kind of tears that lived on that bus bench. These were different, not of pain, of possibility. "I don't know if I could help enough," she whispered. "You already have," Evan said. She looked at him then, really looked at him. At the tired man with gentle eyes who was still learning how to breathe without his wife. At the little girl who believed in hugs more than logic. "I don't want to be a burden," Lee said softly. "You won't be," Evan replied. Rosie reached across the table and placed her tiny hand over Lee's. "You'd be home." Silence, soft, powerful. Then Lee spoke only 3 words, not yes, not no, not yet, just, "Can I think?" Evan nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He slid a folded receipt across the table with his phone number. She looked at it like it was something fragile, a new beginning disguised as a scrap of paper. They walked out of the diner together but paused at the corner where their paths would part. Lee held the paper tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she added, "No one's ever seen me. Not really." "You did." Rosie stepped forward and hugged her again, this time with no hesitation. "You were never invisible," she whispered. And with that, Lee walked away, not toward an answer, but toward a choice. What happens tomorrow at 3:30 p.m., when school ends, and someone must be there for Rosie? The next morning was crisp, the kind where the air smelled faintly of rain even if the sky was dry. It was Sunday, story hour at the Willow Creek Library. Evan and Rosie went every week. It was their ritual. A tradition started back when things were still whole, when love was still part of their routine. Rosie skipped ahead, clutching her favorite book, The Moon Who Lost Its Light. Evan followed at a steady pace, not rushing, but not relaxed either. Something was different about today. He could feel it. Hope has a heartbeat. He checked his phone, no message from Lee. He told himself that was okay. She had a lot to consider. She needed space. But a small piece of him hoped, wished that she would show up. They entered the children's reading room, where cushions lay scattered on a colorful rug and paper stars hung from the ceiling. Rosie settled down cross-legged in the front row. Evan chose a chair near the back, where parents typically traded smiles of exhaustion and solidarity. He kept looking at the door. 10:29 a.m. she wasn't coming. 10:30. Story time began. The librarian, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Gardner, opened the storybook. Evan stopped checking the door, almost. 10 minutes into the reading, the door opened. Lee stepped inside, not hurried, not dramatic, just quietly present. Her hair was still slightly damp, like she'd showered somewhere on purpose. She wore clean clothes, simple jeans, and a gray sweater, not fancy, but intentional. She didn't look like the woman on the bench anymore. She looked like someone trying. Trying matters. Rosie's face lit up as if the sun had walked into the room. "You came," she whispered, not caring that story time was in progress. She scooted over and patted the carpet eagerly. Lee sat beside her and Rosie leaned against her, just a little, like it was already normal. Evan's grip on his coffee cup loosened. When story time ended, kids ran to pick out books and parents chatted. Lee stood, smoothing her sweater nervously. She wasn't holding the photo anymore, but it was in her bag. She walked toward Evan, not with hesitation, but with purpose. "I thought about your offer," she said softly. He nodded, careful, not pushing. "And I kept thinking maybe it wasn't about needing help," she continued. "Maybe it was about being needed." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "Evan," she said, exhaling, "I'd like to try." She added quickly, almost apologetically, "I don't know how long it'll work. I don't know if I'll be good enough, but I'd like to try." Evan didn't speak right away. He didn't rush. Instead, he offered the kind of smile that comes from deep in the chest, the one that only arrives when something painful starts to feel lighter. "That's all I was hoping for," he said. "Just a beginning." Rosie ran back, books in hand. "Is she coming?" Lee knelt down. "I think," she said, looking between father and daughter, "I think I am." Rosie didn't jump or cheer this time. She simply took Lee's hand, like it was always supposed to be there. They walked out of the library together, not as strangers, not yet as anything defined, but as something rare in between. A beginning. Outside, the November air smelled like wood smoke and coming rain. Evan paused at the sidewalk. "If you want," he said gently, "we can go see the apartment now." Lee looked nervous, then curious, then something close to hopeful. "Let's go," she whispered. They walked in silence, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of change, quiet, delicate, growing. What happens when Lee finally steps inside the little apartment above the garage and realizes it's not just a room, but a chance at rebuilding her life? The walk to Evan's house was quiet, but not heavy. Leaves skittered across the pavement like tiny dancers, and Rosie skipped ahead while humming a song only she knew. Lee walked beside Evan, hands tucked into her sleeves, not talking, but not uncomfortable either. They turned onto Maplewood Lane, where modest houses sat under large maple trees, their branches now bare from winter's approach. Evan's house was a pale blue one with white trim, a little worn but lived in. Warm, honest. Lee noticed the garden bed in front, currently empty except for a single faded sunflower leaning stubbornly toward the weak sun. "It bloomed late," Evan said when he noticed her looking. "Survived longer than all the others." He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Rosie ran ahead, pointing excitedly. "Ellie, that's the garage apartment." He blinked. So did Lee. Neither had heard her call her Ellie before. But somehow it fit. The garage apartment stood behind the main house, simple, small, with 3 windows and a little porch light that flickered uncertainly. Evan unlocked the door. The hinges squeaked softly as it opened. Lee stepped inside. The studio apartment was small, maybe 350 square feet. A worn but clean futon sat against the far wall, beneath a window that looked out over the backyard. A kitchenette with a sink, two burners, and an old fridge stood to the right. A door led to a small bathroom. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't new, but it was hers, no one else's, no shelter curfew, no fear of being asked to leave. No eyes watching, judging, deciding whether she was worth trusting. It was the first space she'd been inside in months that felt safe. And safe is different than sheltered. Safe means belonging might be possible. She crossed the room slowly, touching the countertop, opening the bathroom door, turning on the tap. Hot water gushed out. She nearly cried at hot water. She opened the closet, empty but ready. She turned to Evan, tears in her eyes, but this time they didn't carry despair. "Would I really be allowed to stay here?" she whispered. "Not as charity," Evan said softly. "Not as a guest, not as a case to fix, but as someone who helps. As part of something that helps all of us." Rosie climbed onto the futon and threw herself backward dramatically. "It's bouncy, you could sleep and read here." Lee laughed. The sound was new, lighter, like wind chimes instead of cracked glass. She sat beside Rosie, hands gentle on the blanket. Evan lingered near the doorway, careful not to rush her, careful not to intrude on the moment. Finally, Lee stood fully, looked out the window toward the small yard, and whispered, "I could plant something here." Evan blinked. "What would you plant?" Lee thought for a moment. "Something that survives cold seasons, something that waits but still grows." He nodded, almost smiling. "Then it will fit right in." They walked back to the main house, where a modest dinner of pasta and salad waited. Evan apologized for its simplicity. Lee smiled softly. "You have no idea how good it looks." Rosie talked through dinner about school, books, and her ongoing campaign to convince her father they needed a dog. Afterward, Lee helped with dishes automatically before hesitating, unsure if it was her place. "It is," Evan said quietly. "It will be, if you want it to be." Night settled gently over Maplewood Lane, and frost began to form on the windows. Before Lee walked back to the apartment for the night, Rosie hugged her. Not out of kindness this time, but out of familiarity. "Are you coming back in the morning?" she asked softly. Lee cupped her cheeks. "Morning, afternoon, and after school too, if that's okay." "It's perfect," Rosie whispered. When Lee stepped into the little apartment and closed the door, she didn't cry. She just sat on the futon and listened to the silence. It wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. There's a difference. That night she slept, really slept. For the first time in a very, very long time. But what happens when helping Rosie isn't just about picking her up from school, but helping her heal from a grief she doesn't know how to talk about? Routine found its way into their days like sunlight sneaking in through forgotten windows. By the end of the second week, Lee stood every afternoon at Willow Creek Elementary, leaning slightly against the brick wall near the oak tree, waiting. And every afternoon at exactly 3:32 p.m., Rosie burst through the school doors like a firework in motion, backpack half unzipped, hair wild, grin wide. "Ellie," she'd call, and that name, the one she'd given Lee without asking permission, stayed. They'd walk home, chatting about art class, playground drama, and what animal they would be if they could choose. Rosie changed her answer daily. Today she was a red panda. But on one oddly quiet Tuesday, Rosie didn't start the usual chatter. Instead, she walked slower, kicking leaves as they made their way down Maplewood Lane. "Ellie," she said softly. "Yes, do you think grown-ups ever get scared?" It wasn't a naive question, it was a knowing one. "They do," Lee said, "but sometimes they hide it better." Rosie glanced at her, then asked, "Are you scared?" Lee thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but I'm less scared than I used to be." "Why?" "Because I'm not alone anymore." They didn't say anything else for a long time. Some truths don't need echoes. When they arrived home, Rosie went straight to the kitchen table to do homework. Lee made tea. They sat together, quiet but not silent. Halfway through a reading assignment, Rosie's voice broke the calm. "It's about stars," she said, frowning slightly. "It says some stars we see died a long time ago, but the light is still traveling." She looked up. "Is that real?" "It is," Lee answered. "Starlight lasts, even when the star is gone." Rosie pressed her lips together. Then she whispered, "My mom used to say hugs are like starlight. They last even after the person isn't there to give them any more." Something tender and aching settled in the room. Rosie didn't cry, but she didn't hide either. That was new. She turned the page but didn't read it. Instead, she quietly said, "Sometimes I pretend I'm not sad, because if I pretend hard enough, people won't worry about me. And then maybe I won't worry too." Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was describing a weather pattern. Lee didn't rush to respond. Then she placed her hand, gently, purposefully, over Rosie's. "You don't have to pretend with me." Rosie's eyes glistened, but she held them open. "I know," she whispered, and then for the first time, not just a hug, but a real lean. Later that evening, when Evan arrived home, oil-smudged, exhausted, carrying the weight of both work and parenthood, he walked into a house that smelled like roasted vegetables instead of microwaved leftovers. He found Lee and Rosie at the table, homework finished, laughing about something involving a squirrel stealing someone's sandwich at recess. It was ordinary, but extraordinary. Evan stood still for a moment, watching them, not with surprise, but with wonder. After dinner, when Rosie was tucked into bed, Lee stepped outside to the back porch. The air was cold enough to need a blanket, so she wrapped one around her shoulders. Evan joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. Steam rose between them. "She talks about her mom more now," he said quietly. "I know," Lee replied. "Not just about losing her," he continued. "About remembering her with joy. Not just pain. That matters. It does." A long silence followed, not heavy, just honest. Finally, Evan spoke. "You're helping her heal in ways I didn't know how to." Lee looked at him. "I'm not fixing her," she said gently. "I'm just giving her room to feel." He nodded. "She's doing the rest." They looked through the window where Rosie had taped her drawing of a night sky full of stars, some big, some small, some bright, some softly fading. Underneath, in shaky handwriting, she'd written, "Stuff that still shines even if you can't see it anymore." Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of understanding. When grief begins to loosen its grip, something else quietly takes its place. Something scarier, softer, and far more fragile. What happens when that something begins to look like love? By the 3rd month, things no longer felt temporary. The futon in the little apartment above the garage had been replaced with a proper bed. Not new, but comfortable. Lee had found second-hand lamps at a thrift store and gently strung warm fairy lights along the window frame. A potted rosemary plant sat by the sill, not for decoration, but because it smelled like memory. It reminded her of Sunday mornings in her old life when her sister would make lemon and rosemary scones. Roots don't have to grow in soil. Sometimes they grow in people. Some nights Lee still cried quietly. Grief didn't leave just because life got softer. But now she cried in a place where tears didn't feel like failure. And slowly, without announcement or ceremony, she stopped referring to the apartment as the space. She called it my place. As winter deepened, small things began to matter more. Like coats draped over the same chair every afternoon. Like Rosie shouting, "I'm home," as she burst through the door, backpack flying, boots half untied. Like how Lee always asked, "How was school?" and meant it. Like how Evan lingered a little longer in the kitchen after work, not because he needed anything, but because they were there. It wasn't instant, it wasn't planned. But one day they looked around and realized they weren't just sharing space, they were sharing life. One evening, a storm rattled the windows, wind howling through the trees like something searching for answers. Rosie came padding downstairs in her pajamas, holding a pillow to her chest. "Can I sleep downstairs tonight?" she asked. Before Evan could respond, Rosie turned, not to him, but to Lee. "Can I sleep near you and Ellie?" she asked quietly. "The dark feels different when it's windy." Ellie. The name had stuck, not by choice, not by decision, but by belonging. Lee glanced at Evan. He nodded softly. So that night, the three of them built a messy nest of blankets and pillows on the living room floor. Lee read aloud from a book, her voice steady, slow, soothing. Rosie fell asleep halfway through, head resting against Lee's shoulder, hand loosely holding her sweater. Evan watched them from the other side of the blanket pile. He didn't speak. He just watched. Not with longing, not with confusion, but with recognition. This looks like family. Later, Lee gently tucked Rosie in and set the book aside. Evan was still there, sitting on the floor, watching the firelight dance across the walls. "She trusts you," he said quietly. Lee hesitated, then sat on the rug. "Children trust until they're given a reason not to," he nodded slowly. "And adults," she smiled faintly. "Adults trust only when they are given reasons to." A soft silence followed, the kind that didn't separate them but connected them. Finally, Evan spoke. "I was afraid my daughter would grow up without softness," he said. "I didn't know how to help her feel things, I only knew how to help her stay strong." Lee looked at him carefully. "And now," he exhaled, "now I think there has to be space for both." They didn't look away, not for a long moment. Something shifted, not love, not yet, but something like the beginning of it. A crack in the wall where light could get through. The next morning, Rosie burst into the kitchen, hair tangled, face glowing. "Ellie," she declared, "if you're staying for a long time, we should plant things, not outside, inside. Things that don't mind winter." Lee smiled. "What kind of things?" "Ones that grow slow," Rosie said confidently. "Slow-growing things last longer," she paused, "like feelings." Evan nearly choked on his coffee, and Lee, she didn't laugh. She looked at Rosie like she had just said the truest thing in the world. Maybe she had. What happens when a family begins to form, not in words, not in promises, but in everyday moments that quietly say, "You belong here." Winter eased into early spring, and with it, the house started changing. Not in big, dramatic ways, in quieter ways. In ways that meant life was being lived, not just passed through. Like how the coat hooks by the door now had 3 jackets instead of 2. Like how the fridge began holding school drawings, scribbled notes, and grocery lists in 3 different handwritings. Like how the bookshelf, not the one in Lee's apartment, but the one in the main house, now held books that hadn't been there before. Books she brought. Books she used to read to children at her old library job. Books she wasn't ready to let go of. One day, Evan noticed something small but not small at all. He came home from work, and there on the hall table was a mug. Not his, not Rosie's, Lee's. Placed there casually like it wasn't a guest item anymore. Like it belonged, like she did. That night during dinner, real dinner with roasted chicken and green beans and mashed potatoes, Rosie insisted. Evan watched them. Not just the way Lee helped Rosie with her math after dessert. Not just the way Rosie looked for Lee's reaction when she told jokes, but the fact that somewhere along the way, this stopped being a trade. It simply became life. After Rosie went to bed, Evan walked Lee outside to the small garden patch she had been tending near the fence. It wasn't much. Some early lavender cuttings, a few young herbs still finding their roots, but it was growing. Quietly. Like everything else. "She likes having you here," Evan said softly, watching Lee adjust a small rosemary sprout. Lee didn't look up. "I like being here," he nodded. "She asked me the other day," he added carefully, "if I thought you might stay forever." This time she did look up, not startled, not uncomfortable, just surprised and quietly moved. "What did you say?" "I told her," he said, steady and honest, "that staying forever is never a choice someone makes all at once. It's something you choose a little more every day." They stood there among little plants and soft moonlight, feeling something that didn't need to be named. Not yet, weeks passed. Spring settled in like hope taking root. The house changed again. There were now Saturday pancake mornings, Lee cooking, Rosie stirring batter, Evan attempting not to burn anything with mixed results. There was laughter. Not just Rosie's, but Evan's. And once, though she tried to hide it, Lee's too. The kind that escapes before sadness can stop it. One Friday in April, something happened, something small, something ordinary, but not ordinary at all. That morning, Evan had left earlier than usual. He'd written a note for Rosie on a napkin, breakfast in the fridge, be good, be kind, love you. Dad, he left one for Lee too, just 2 words, thank you, folded, simple. Placed by the coffee pot. When Lee found it, she didn't cry, but she kept it, not because of the words, but because of what they meant. Someone had noticed. What she was doing, who she was becoming. That afternoon, when she picked Rosie up from school, the little girl was unusually quiet. Not playful, not talkative, just thoughtful. Finally, as they reached the corner of Maplewood Lane, Rosie asked, "How do you know when someone is part of your family?" Lee slowed her steps. "What do you think?" she asked. Rosie didn't answer at once. Then she said softly, "I think you know someone is family when home feels wrong without them." Lee didn't speak. She couldn't. Sometimes children tell truths adults aren't brave enough to say first. That night, Lee stood by the small garden again, gently brushing soil from her palms. Evan joined her. Quiet, still in work clothes. But his face was softer than usual. He didn't speak for a while. Then very carefully he said something that was not a question, not a request, not a confession, but a truth. "You're not temporary, Lee." The wind was quiet. Her heartbeat wasn't. She didn't answer. Not with words, she simply stayed. But what happens when not temporary starts feeling dangerously close to something else, something like love, something like home? Late spring brought warmer evenings, longer light, and a backyard slowly turning green again. The small garden Lee planted in winter had survived. Lavender sprouting, rosemary stretching upward, little shoots of mint sneaking through the soil like quiet hope. Things grow when they are safe. One evening, Evan came home early. That almost never happened. Lee was helping Rosie practice a poem for school, her voice soft and steady while Rosie tried her best to recite without skipping lines. "The heart remembers what the world forgets," Rosie read slowly, "and sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the biggest beginning." When she finished, she looked pleased with herself. "That's beautiful," Lee said. "It's true," Rosie replied, smiling. That evening they had dinner early. Simple pasta, salad, laughter over spilled milk, and a dramatic retelling of how Rosie had defeated 3 imaginary dragons at recess. When the dishes were done and Rosie had gone upstairs to pick bedtime books, Evan lingered in the kitchen, hands in pockets, unsure but present. Lee wiped the counter absent-mindedly, quiet but not uncomfortable. Just full of things waiting to be said, Evan leaned against the doorway. "You've changed this house." Lee looked up. He continued, voice low. "It didn't used to feel like this. It used to feel quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. Like waiting for something that never came." Lee set down the cloth slowly. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking past her toward the living room where sunlight made warm patterns across the couch, even after sunset. "And now?" she asked. He took a long breath. "Now it feels full," he said. "Not crowded, not busy, just full, like a place where things grow again." She didn't answer, but she stepped closer. He turned to look at her. They didn't stand close enough to touch, but close enough to know. Something had changed, not suddenly, but steadily, like seasons, like growing roots. Not love, maybe, but something kindred, something right. He spoke again, voice softer. I used to believe I had already lived the best moments of my life. That life after loss was just about managing, making the best of what remained. Lee's eyes softened. And now, he looked at her for a long moment. Now, he whispered, I think maybe the best moments don't only come once. Silence, deep, meaningful, the kind that doesn't separate people, the kind that gently pulls them closer, not with urgency, but with peace. Just then, footsteps on the stairs, Rosie clutching 2 books, one in each hand. One for Ellie, she said, smiling sleepily, and one for Dad because good nights should have 2 voices. It was simple, but it was everything. Later that night, after the stories, after the good-night hugs, after the door had closed softly behind Rosie, Lee stood in the hallway. So did Evan. Both lingered. Neither left. Finally, Evan said very softly, when I said you're not temporary, I meant it. She nodded, her voice barely there. I know. A pause, then, like an invitation that respected the beauty of time, he said, you don't have to leave later tonight, you know. You could stay downstairs, just share the quiet. She hesitated, not from fear, but from awe. Then quietly, without ceremony, she simply said, okay. They sat on the couch, not touching, not filling the space with unnecessary words. Just sharing warm tea, soft light, and peaceful silence. The kind that only exists when 2 people finally feel safe. At one point she asked, what if this is the beginning of something we don't know how to name? He smiled, then spoke words that changed something in both of them. We don't have to name it, he said. We just have to grow it. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a visitor in that house. She felt like someone whose chair would always be there. But beginnings have a way of becoming something deeper. What happens when this quiet, growing bond finally becomes love, openly, courageously, and without apology? Summer slipped into the edges of June, and the house on Maplewood Lane felt different. Not because of decorations, not because of renovations, but because life had taken root there. There were shoes by the door now, 3 different sizes, lined up in no particular order. There were lavender plants on the windowsill that didn't just survive, but thrived. There were drawings on the fridge of a family, one tall, one small, one with curly hair, all smiling. One afternoon, Rosie stood in the backyard, barefoot in soft grass, watching fireflies begin to appear in flickers. She turned to Lee. Did you ever think, she asked, that we would be a family? Lee knelt in the grass beside her. I didn't know what we would be, she said gently. But I knew it felt right. Rosie looked thoughtful. Sometimes families are chosen, not born. She didn't say it like a child. She said it like someone who had lived it. Evan stood by the porch door watching them. It struck him, not suddenly, but in a warm, undeniable way. They weren't just helping each other heal. They had become each other's home. It happened on a Saturday morning, fittingly at the same farmer's market where it all began. Only this time, Evan didn't walk past her. He stood beside her. And this time, Lee didn't sit alone on a bench. She held Rosie's hand while Evan held hers. They walked past the apple booth, past the flower stand, past the honey jars and small-town musicians, until they stood beneath the willow tree in the center of the market. The same tree where people danced, laughed, made promises. Evan turned to her, not nervous, not unsure, just certain. You once said, he told her softly, that some things grow quietly without asking permission, without asking if they are ready. She nodded. And I told you, she whispered, the strongest roots are the ones that don't force themselves, they just stay. Evan reached into his pocket, no spectacle, no classic romantic speech. Just truth, quiet, steady. Lee, he said, I'm not asking for perfect or easy or certain. I'm asking for your ordinary days, for planting herbs in the spring, for bedtime stories, for helping Rosie's shoes find a matching pair. I'm asking you to stay. He opened his hand. A ring, simple, bright, not flashy, but sincere. She didn't cry at first. She just breathed, slowly. Like someone who'd finally found air after living too long underwater. Then she whispered, "I already chose to stay," but still smiled through tears as she added, "Yes." Rosie screamed. The market clapped. The old man selling apples gave them a thumbs up. And when Evan slipped the ring onto Lee's finger, she didn't feel like her life was beginning again. She felt like it had already begun months ago, in a hug, on a bench, with a child who saw her first. A year later, the garden in the backyard was full. Lavender, rosemary, marigolds, and wildflowers, unplanned but thriving. Rosie sat in the grass writing in her journal. It was titled, "Things That Last Even If You Can't See Them." She wrote, "Some things leave, but they don't really go. That's how starlight works. And love, and hugs." Then she drew their family, one tall, one small, one named Ellie. Underneath it, she wrote 3 words, "We stayed anyway." And that was the truth. Not a fairy tale, not magic, just kindness. That stayed, that healed, that became love.